The airport buzzed with its usual rhythm, announcements echoing, passengers moving through the gates, the scent of coffee lingering in the air. Flight AZ-174 was boarding, a full flight heading across the country. Inside the aircraft, passengers settled into their seats, placing bags in the overhead bins, adjusting their seatbelts, and scrolling through their phones. The atmosphere was peaceful. Just another routine flight. Then, an elderly man stepped onto the plane. His steps were slow but steady, his frail hands gripping a boarding pass. He wore a neatly pressed jacket, and a well-worn veteran's cap perched proudly on his head. The cap had a military insignia, its fabric slightly faded but unmistakable. As he walked down the aisle, passengers stole glances, some offering small smiles, others too absorbed in their own worlds to notice. The elderly man moved carefully, searching for his seat. A young businessman sat near the middle of the cabin, dressed in a sharp suit, his wristwatch gleaming under the cabin lights. He looked up from his tablet, his brows furrowing as he watched the old man inch forward. The veteran reached his row and attempted to lift his carry-on into the overhead compartment. His hands trembled slightly, his arms lacking the strength they once had. The businessman let out a loud sigh, rolling his eyes. "Oh, come on," he muttered under his breath, just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. A flight attendant, noticing the struggle, quickly stepped in. "Let me help you with that, sir," she said warmly, taking the bag and securing it above. The old man smiled appreciatively, murmuring a quiet, "Thank you, miss." The businessman shook his head, clicking his tongue in irritation as he leaned back in his seat. "Unbelievable," he muttered. As the flight crew made final checks, the atmosphere inside the cabin remained calm. But for some, tension had already begun to simmer. The engines roared to life as the plane taxied down the runway. Within moments, it lifted into the sky, the world below shrinking into a patchwork of green and gray. The flight had officially begun. Passengers settled in, some watching movies, others closing their eyes for a nap. The flight attendants moved gracefully down the aisle, preparing for meal service. When the trays were finally distributed, the elderly veteran carefully unfolded his napkin. His hands, worn from time, trembled slightly as he picked up his fork. He ate slowly, his movements deliberate. The young businessman sitting a few rows away smirked, nudging the person beside him. He leaned in, lowering his voice but not enough to go unnoticed. "Look at this guy," he chuckled, shaking his head. "Can't even hold a fork steady. Maybe they should have a separate flight for people like that." The passenger beside him gave an awkward smile, but didn't respond. The businessman wasn't done. He snorted under his breath. "Why do they even let these old guys fly? Takes them an hour just to chew a bite." A mother with a young child sitting nearby shifted uncomfortably. She glanced toward the old man, her lips pressing together. The veteran didn't seem to react, his focus on his meal. A flight attendant passing by slowed her steps, having overheard the remark. Her brows furrowed slightly, but she hesitated, unsure if she should step in. The businessman, completely unaware of the growing tension around him, took a sip of his drink, still smirking. The veteran finally paused, setting his fork down gently. He had heard everything. His eyes, though weary, remained kind. He didn't look at the businessman. He simply exhaled, the corners of his lips curling into a faint, unreadable smile. He had faced worse. He had endured far more than careless words. But someone else on that flight had heard everything too. And they weren't about to stay silent. As the businessman continued to make snide remarks, a young man sitting just a row behind them had heard every word. His gaze had flickered to the old veteran, and his hands had clenched around the armrests in frustration. He wasn't the type to stay quiet when someone was being wronged, especially when it involved a man who had given so much for this country. With a deep breath, he shifted forward in his seat, his voice firm but calm. "Sir, do you even know who you're mocking?" The businessman froze for a moment, his smirk faltering. He hadn't expected to be challenged, certainly not by someone younger, much less a stranger on a plane. He turned, his expression condescending. "Excuse me?" The young man didn't back down, his eyes steady. "That man you're making fun of? He's a war hero." The businessman raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "A war hero? Please, I'm just trying to enjoy my meal in peace." He shrugged, dismissing the young man's words as if they were nothing more than a mild inconvenience. But the young man wasn't finished. "Do you have any idea what that man went through?" His voice remained steady, but there was a fire in it now. "That old man, the one you're mocking for eating slowly, saved hundreds of lives in a battle that could have been lost. He's the reason some of your freedom even exists." Several passengers in the nearby rows, who had been too hesitant to speak up, now started to turn their heads. The businessman's posture stiffened, but the young man's words had already planted a seed of curiosity. The mother with the child subtly glanced at the old man, her discomfort turning into quiet admiration. The young man continued, his voice unshakable. "That veteran you're mocking? His name is Jack Andrews. He served in Vietnam, and he's a recipient of the Silver Star. He doesn't need your pity or your mockery. He's earned his right to sit on this flight just like anyone else." The businessman scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. "So what? That was decades ago. He's just an old man now." The young man's eyes darkened for a moment, his words sharper than before. "You think time erases honor? You think it makes a difference that he's older? His bravery isn't gone. It's in every wrinkle on his face, every step he takes. So think twice before you speak." The businessman's face reddened. He opened his mouth to retort, but stopped, realizing the weight of the situation had shifted. The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath, all eyes now on him. But the old man, Jack Andrews, remained silent, his gaze fixed out the window. A faint smile curled on his lips, but he didn't speak a word. His silence said more than anything else could. The tension in the cabin felt almost tangible. The young man's words had left a mark, but the businessman still hadn't fully processed the weight of his actions. He sat back in his seat, arms crossed, clearly uncomfortable, but unwilling to apologize. The cabin remained eerily quiet, save for the soft hum of the plane's engines and the occasional shifting of passengers in their seats. Then, without warning, the sound of the pilot's voice crackled through the intercom, filling the plane. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking." It was a deep, commanding voice, smooth but full of warmth. The passengers, many of whom were deep in their own worlds, looked up, surprised at the sudden announcement. Even the businessman stiffened, wondering what was coming. "We're cruising smoothly, at 30,000 feet, the pilot continued, "and I just wanted to take a moment to share something special with all of you." The voice paused for a brief moment, as if preparing to deliver something meaningful. "You see, we have a very honored guest aboard today. A guest who, for many of us, represents the very best of what this country stands for." At that moment, the young man who had defended the veteran sat back in his seat, his hands still clenched, but his heart racing with anticipation. The other passengers began to shift in their seats, their curiosity piqued. The man sitting in row 15, the one with the veteran's cap, is Jack Andrews. The pilot's voice softened slightly, as if the very name carried weight. In 1968, during the Vietnam War, Jack Andrews was part of a mission that was supposed to be a routine patrol. What it became was a fight for survival, a fight that could have been lost if not for his actions. The cabin fell silent, all ears now on the pilot's words. The businessman's face flushed a deep shade of red, as he slowly, almost imperceptibly, turned toward the veteran. "On that mission," the pilot continued, "Jack's unit was ambushed, surrounded by enemy forces. But Jack didn't hesitate. He ran into the heart of the battle, pulling wounded soldiers to safety, even as gunfire rained down on him. His bravery and selflessness saved an entire platoon that day. And for that, he was awarded the Silver Star." The veteran's head remained turned toward the window, but something in his posture seemed to relax, as if the weight of the words had found their place. The pilot's voice grew quieter, more personal. "So, to the gentleman who's been sitting near him, it's an honor to have him on board today." A wave of silence passed over the cabin. The businessman's face had gone pale, his hands now resting on his lap, the smug expression long gone. He finally glanced toward the veteran, his expression faltering with a mix of embarrassment and guilt. For a moment, everything stood still. Then, a slow applause began to ripple through the cabin. It started softly, but within seconds, nearly every passenger was clapping, some standing, others nodding in respect. The flight attendants who had witnessed everything unfold joined in, their faces glowing with admiration. The businessman, now thoroughly uncomfortable, shifted unsteadily in his seat. His eyes darted around, looking anywhere but at the veteran, and as the applause continued, Jack Andrews remained silent, his gaze still out the window, but now a quiet smile tugged at the corners of his lips. The applause echoed throughout the cabin, each clap like a wave of respect washing over the veteran. Jack Andrews sat there, slightly stunned, his weathered face softening in the light. He had never sought recognition for his service, never expected it. He wasn't one to look for praise. His hands, still trembling slightly, gripped the armrests as he glanced around, surprised by the attention. Passengers, once quiet and detached, were now on their feet, some clapping, others nodding in acknowledgement. It wasn't just out of respect for a man who had served, it was a shared realization of the sacrifice he had made, and the courage he still carried. The businessman, who had once been so bold in his ridicule, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His face had drained of color, his usual smugness replaced with a deep, raw discomfort. His eyes darted from the veteran to the clapping passengers, unable to find a way to hide the growing guilt settling in his chest. He muttered something under his breath, but the words were lost in the hum of the plane. The flight attendants, noticing the veteran's surprise, moved quickly to his side. "Sir, can we offer you anything else? A blanket? Something to drink?" One of them asked gently, her tone full of warmth. Jack shook his head, a small smile flickering on his lips. "I'm fine, miss. Just a little too much attention, that's all." But the attendants insisted, offering him a special seat cushion for extra comfort. They treated him with a care that was gentle but respectful, making sure he had everything he needed. The businessman, now utterly embarrassed, cleared his throat and turned toward the veteran. He fidgeted in his seat, his eyes shifting around the cabin before he finally mumbled, I'm sorry, I didn't mean." Jack turned toward him, his eyes soft but wise. He'd seen much in his lifetime, and it wasn't often that someone admitted their mistake. "It's all right, son," Jack said, his voice quiet but firm, carrying a sense of peace. "We all have lessons to learn." The businessman swallowed, looking down at his hands, unable to meet the veteran's gaze. A few passengers watching the exchange wiped away a tear. The mother with the child glanced over at her young son, who had been quietly observing the entire exchange. Her heart swelled with pride, knowing that her son had just witnessed the kind of humility and wisdom that most people spent a lifetime searching for. Jack Andrews remained in his seat, calm and collected, as the plane continued its journey. There was no need for words, for the moment had already spoken volumes. The businessman sat back, his face still red, but there was something different in the way he held himself now. Something quieter, more thoughtful. He had learned a valuable lesson, though the weight of it might take him some time to fully understand. As the flight continued, the mood in the cabin shifted. The conversation between strangers, once filled with awkwardness and tension, had transformed into something deeper, a shared understanding of respect, humility, and the value of learning from our mistakes. Jack Andrews may have been just one man on a plane, but in that moment, he had touched the hearts of everyone around him. As the plane began its descent, the atmosphere had shifted completely. The once tense cabin now felt lighter, as if a collective understanding had settled in. The businessman, his face still flushed with embarrassment, avoided eye contact with anyone. He sat rigidly in his seat, his hands folded neatly in his lap, lost in thought. His earlier arrogance had melted away, replaced by a quiet, unsettling realization of his mistake. The young man who had defended the veteran stood and moved toward him. "Here, let me help you with your bag," he said kindly, offering his hand. The veteran, Jack Andrews, smiled warmly, a deep gratitude in his eyes. "Thank you, son," he said softly. His voice was steady, filled with appreciation for the kindness shown to him. As the plane touched down, the pilot could be seen walking toward the cabin door. He approached Jack Andrews with a salute, his hand resting over his heart. "It's an honor, sir," he said with respect. Jack nodded, tipping his cap slightly in return. One by one, passengers began to leave their seats, and many walked past Jack, stopping to offer their thanks. "Thank you for your service," one woman said, while another simply placed a hand on his shoulder in quiet appreciation. The businessman, clearly embarrassed, was the first to exit, his steps quick, avoiding anyone's gaze. But as he walked away, there was something different in the way he carried himself. A quiet change, a shift in his perspective. As the passengers filed out of the plane, the mother with the child remained seated for a moment, her gaze fixed on the young man who had stood up for the veteran. Her eyes softened as she watched him, his actions resonating deeply with her. She had seen him speak out with such conviction and respect, defending a man who had earned more than most could ever understand. Her son, still a young boy, sat quietly beside her, absorbed in his own world, but his mother saw the curiosity in his eyes. She knew he was paying attention, even if he couldn't yet grasp the full weight of what had unfolded. Leaning down, she gently cupped his ear with her hand, her voice barely above a whisper. "I hope my son grows up to be like that young man," she said, her words heavy with both admiration and a deep sense of pride. There was no mistaking the emotion in her voice. She wasn't just speaking about the young man's bravery in defending a stranger, but about the integrity and character he had shown in that moment. Her heart swelled, knowing that this was the kind of man she wanted her son to look up to, the kind of person she hoped he would someday become. The boy, sensing the importance of her words, nodded solemnly. He didn't fully understand, but he could see the respect in his mother's eyes. And that, in itself, was enough to make him appreciate the moment. Meanwhile, the camera turned its focus to Jack Andrews as he stood up from his seat and made his way toward the terminal. The clapping had stopped, but the atmosphere around him was still charged, filled with a quiet reverence. His pace was steady and measured, yet there was a grace in the way he moved, as though he had long ago learned that true strength wasn't something that needed to be announced to the world. Jack didn't seek recognition. He didn't need it. His shoulders were not hunched with pride, but carried a quiet dignity that came from a lifetime of service, sacrifice, and wisdom. As he walked through the terminal, his head remained held high, not out of arrogance, but out of peace. He knew that he had given everything he had in his life, and that his actions had spoken for him. Today, the people around him had learned something simple, yet profound. That respect for others, humility in the face of adversity, and kindness toward those who needed it most were not things to be taken for granted. They were virtues that carried a weight, even in a world that sometimes seemed to forget their significance. The camera lingered on Jack for a moment longer, capturing the quiet pride in his step as he faded into the crowd. The passengers who had witnessed it all could only hope that the moment they had shared would stay with them, just as it would stay with Jack, who continued on his way, his heart at peace. He had left an impression on their lives, even if he hadn't asked for it. And in doing so, he had reminded them of the kind of world they could still build if they held on to these simple values. As the screen slowly faded, the image of Jack walking away, his back straight and his heart full, was the last thing they saw. A man who had been through so much, yet carried himself with quiet strength. And as the screen turned to black, it was clear his impact would not be forgotten. Thank you so much for watching this heartfelt story. It's a reminder that sometimes, it takes just one person to change everything. To stand up, to show respect, and to teach us all a valuable lesson. Jack Andrews, with his quiet strength, has inspired us to appreciate the sacrifices others have made and to carry kindness with us in our everyday lives. If you were moved by this story, don't forget to like this video, comment and share your thoughts, and subscribe to stay tuned for more inspiring and emotional stories. Your support means the world to us and helps spread these important messages of respect, empathy, and bravery. Thanks again for watching, and remember, kindness can change lives, and so can you. Until next time.